Hey, I'm Matt Geiger. My goal is to tell you the full story, not the liberal story or the conservative story, and that's why I'm giving you a moderate's take on the issues. This video is all about low-income housing, and to know where we need to go on the issue, you really need to understand where we've already been. Government involvement with housing really began as part of FDR's New Deal agenda. In 1933, the Public Works Administration was created with the goal of putting people to work during the recession, just sort of building stuff, airports, bridges, schools, things like that. Housing was supposed to be a huge part of that. The housing was intended not for the poor, though, but for middle-class people who could pay rent. So the idea was that the debt for the property was subsidized, but not the actual operation of the building. Ultimately, the Public Works Administration sort of failed at doing that. Over 4.5 years, it only built 29,000 units, which was way short of where they wanted to be, mainly because funds were siphoned off for other purposes. Local politicians, unions, businesses, they all delayed the projects, and government quotas for black hiring was fiercely resisted by employers and unions alike. Now, this was intended to be a short-term program to help people out during the recession, but in 1937, the Wagner-Steagall Housing Act made those subsidies to local public housing agencies permanent. So the law created significantly more housing than the PWA did to help ease housing shortages during the recession, and then again for those returning from war after World War II. The Housing Act of 1949, signed as part of President Truman's Fair Deal, provided more funds for public housing in the hopes of building 800,000 housing units. It also provided funds for urban renewal and slum clearance programs, which meant demolishing those old dilapidated buildings and putting up new ones in their place. And it increased authorization for the Federal Housing Authority to insure mortgages. So looking back, the legacy of that program is sort of mixed, because on one hand, the mortgage insurance did provide opportunities for lots of middle-class renters to buy houses for the first time ever. But from the perspective of housing for the poor and homeless, which is more what we're focusing on, this was a horrible failure. It actually destroyed more housing than it replaced, because buildings were torn down and replaced with fewer units. And then add to that the urban renewal program, which really just meant gentrification, tearing down housing for poor people, replacing it with nice apartments that poor people couldn't afford. Add to that the FHA mortgage insurance and a host of other policies around that time really seriously discriminated against black people who were migrating from the southern states. So the opportunity at home ownership just wasn't extended to them. The Housing Act of 1949 also created what we know today as the projects. Public housing buildings that became dirty, infested with rats and insects, full of drugs, taken over by gangs, just really terrible places. By the mid-60s, policy was shifting from a public housing-centric model to a model providing rent subsidies and relying on market forces to do the rest. That led to the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965. It created a system where government insured mortgages for low-income housing built by nonprofits, who then in turn rented out the apartments and got subsidies for the gap between what the renters could afford and the market rent rate. These were the first government rent subsidies, and they gave way to the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, the law that basically still determines how the majority of low-income individuals obtain housing. This created the mammoth Section 8 housing vouchers program, where the government pays the market costs of rents above 30% of a person's income, and it created grants for low-income housing developments. Funding since then has largely been an expansion on the idea of either subsidizing rent or subsidizing the building of low-income housing with tax credits or grants. The only other major trend in the last 30 years has been away from concentrated poor people and project-type housing in favor of properties with both low-income and market-rate renters spread throughout a variety of neighborhoods. For example, the Hope 6 program in 1992 specifically provided funds for conversion of public housing projects to mixed-income developments. Now, our current efforts are a direct reaction to the unintended consequences of bad policies in the past, but have our policies changed all that much? I mean, I guess we've removed the most egregiously racist elements, and I don't want to downplay the significance of that, but the meat is still and always has been public housing, rent vouchers, and developer credits. But clearly we need to look at making policy changes because we still have a serious housing problem in this country. Thanks for watching.